Alright everybody tuning into the channel today. We have a new video series that myself and Wolf are starting. We're going to call this the library, the lore library, the great library, however we decide to call it. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the lore of certain franchises and games out there. And we are going to go ahead and start this series with Halo. And today's topic in specific is going to be about the Spartan Programs. So the first one that we have here is going to be known retroactively as the Spartan 1 project, but it was originally known as the Orion project. Now, this project made for augmented super soldiers that they were just trying to make themselves a little bit more battle hardy. It started out with the Navy, and this happened before the Human Covenant War and before Project Milner came into effect. So this was just about making sturdier soldiers. They weren't overly done. So they were stronger, they were faster, had a little bit more endurance, and basically they fit into that peak human performance niche. Like what they did was hit the top of the food chain, so to say, without really going outside of the realm of human probability. Though there were some augments that came into effect that actually did put them outside of what was naturally capable of humans, but for the most part they were just the top of the food chain that any human could attain. One of the really interesting members of this program was actually Sergeant Avery Johnson, and if you've played any Halo game, you know Sergeant Johnson, because he knows what the ladies love. The augments, like I said, weren't really over the top, but the augments in this program actually did give the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, concern, because they didn't know if these augments were going to be passed on genetically or not. So it was an interesting beginning, but I wouldn't say that it was totally outside the realm of possibility for humans to create, but it did lay the groundwork for the other Spartan programs. So, Wolf, thinking about how this program came to be and its results, what do you think about the Spartan 1 program? Like just the general soldiers that came out of this program. Like, how do you think that really affected the lore of the Halo universe?
Well, in the origin, like you said, they were meant to be the more tougher and stronger humanoids. You know, they were, some were biologically engineered a little better, different tests were done and everything. But the basis of it all was human society was expanding to new planets, and it was hard to control other planets with terrorist groups, other factions that are popping up, and everything else. So originally they were meant to be a anti-terrorist group here to quell a lot of their more hostile, groups. Some were peaceful, some weren't. Some would still oblige to the Office of Naval Intelligence and all, which is the Marines, or the Navy, depending on however you want to see in the lore. But it was made to help combat those ones that were more aggressive. And that's where Orion itself first implemented.
One of the interesting parts of the Spartan 1 project that always stuck out to me, and it didn't come back around until the Spartan 4 project, is the Spartan 1 project, Project Orion. Those members of that project were actually drafted directly from the other branches of the military for humanity. And it was a much smaller selection group, if I'm not mistaken, as well. They did have a couple of people, if I'm not mistaken, that defected that were actually in the Spartan 1 project to resistance movements throughout the human-controlled space. I feel like that they could have touched a little bit more on this in the lore. We don't really see a whole lot. I mean, we had a couple of books where they did make appearances, and there are touches on it throughout the different forms of media, but they're nowhere near talked about as the other Spartan classes. Some interesting facts about Avery Johnson, though, is he was I how could I say it? He had like a really weird birth. Because if I'm not mistaken, they didn't know if he was born in 2477 or sometime up to 2482, and he died December 11th, 2552. So he was either 70 or 75 years old when he died. And if you actually look at Avery Johnson throughout the games, he does not look like he's a man in his 60s and 70s through those games, and he's keeping up with the Chief like it ain't shit.
Oh yeah, he's if it wasn't for Chief, it'd be Avery Johnson, as the main character. He's up there. He's that whole that steel-hearted battle warrior. Who knows what the ladies like, as quoted. But yeah, he's definitely a different one, and farther down in the lore and prospect, like when we do talk about it, like the Pillar of Autumn and like his whole thing with the Halo rings and everything else, it gets even crazier, and like how him himself it also played such a great factor into the whole Halo lore.
Seeing as how there's not a whole lot of information on the Spartan 1 or Project Orion members as compared to the other Spartan classes, I think this might be the best time to get on to what everybody is familiar with, the Spartan 2 project, seeing as how this is where the titular character from Halo, John 117, came into be. I say we go ahead and move on to that topic. I don't know a whole lot about the augmentations from 1, so I feel a little bit more comfortable going into the Spartan 2 augmentations and the training that they did. It wasn't done, the first project wasn't done by Dr. Catherine Halsey. I can't remember the doctor's name, the scientist's name who did that one, but Dr. Halsey took over for the Spartan 2 project. And so she, knowing her stuff a little bit better, and was willing to make sacrifices. I guess I can't really say sacrifices. I guess I should say heinous crimes for the Spartan 2 project.
Like if the Geneva Convention rules are still in effect, she would have broke mostly all of them.
And some new ones, too, that weren't even around when they made the Geneva Convention.
Correct.
But what her great sin was, is it was her idea to abduct smaller children, train them up as children until they were ready for the bio-augmentation process. So the way that they were going to do this is they were going to go to the outer colonies that wasn't in central space for the UNSC and abduct small children. The small children were then replaced with flash clones, and this is where it gets really bad. Not just abducting the children, they replaced them with flash clones that would die of either mysterious diseases or diseases that looked very similar to cancer or, things of that nature. They were basically they died within, like, I believe, a year and a half of the abduction. So the families never even knew that the real child was abducted. So they had a larger pool for this one, and they trained them in history of war, battlefield tactics, survivability. They had them in some of the books. Now, I haven't read all of them, so I'm not a de facto authority on it. But they were basically making these kids run full military training regimes as like 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And they eventually got to, God, I can't remember what age they were at, but they did get into the bio-augmentations, and I'll go through the list of them here. So they had a carbide ceramic ossification, and basically what this did was it grafted material onto the skeletal structure to make the bones virtually unbreakable. They were told that they didn't need to exceed a coverage of 3%, and I'm not sure if they went over that or not. The risk for that was post-pubescent adolescence skeletal growth spurts could cause severe damage to the bones. And this actually showed up in a lot of what they called the washouts. So there was one trainee in specific, I can't remember his name. He basically was wheelchair ridden for the rest of his life because of the ossification process. Took the ability to walk, and I believe it severely hindered one of his hands. The muscular enhancement injection, this is another one that was really interesting to me, and these two in conjunction come into whenever they actually get their Milner armor. The muscular enhancement was a protein complex injected intramuscularly. It was meant to make the muscles denser and hardier, but it also decrease their lactase recovery time. So if they were to damage their muscles, they would recover at a significantly higher rate than what the average human would. Now there was a problem with this one too, and this is the one I think that killed most of the class off. The ones that actually suffered death. In that case, it was called a fatal cardiac volume increase. So what happened is that they actually increased the patient's heart in such a size that it actually erupted in their chests. There was the catalytic thyroid implant, and this was like a little pellet, and it had human growth hormone in it. And it was meant to make them bigger and stronger at a much faster rate. And this is why, if you go back and read the books, there was an instance where John is actually in a boxing ring, or he's in a gym, and these soldiers are just giving him a bunch of grief. Kind of like read into the book in this scene, you see that he's only like 12 or 13 years old. He maybe I'm 14. He, at the age of 14, looks like a fully grown man because of this. And they start giving him a bunch of crap, and they ended up deciding to square it off in the ring. He was fighting against a hell jumper, but he ended up just pulverizing this guy. He ended this guy's career. He was actually discharged from the military after this. And you got to think, this is a guy that's been training for war and fighting all his life, and he's probably got at least 15, 20 years on John at the time, and John just trounced this guy.
If I remember correctly, John threw a whole dumbbell set at him, and it crushed his lower pelvis, if I remember correctly, or one of them.
Yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah, and John was just in the ring doing some basic training. I read it actually in the book. He was just doing some light boxing on one of the little punching bags in the ring, and they came and gave him shit. And the shit went to the wall to them.
One of the drawbacks for this augmentation was there were some people that actually suffered from elephantitis. So you may have like a normal sized body, but then their right arm may be, swollen and enlarged to an excessive degree. But it also had another side effect for suppressing their sexual drive. This one and the one after it really got to me, but the occipital capillary reversal. And what this did was it boosted blood vessel flow beneath the rods and cones in the subject's eye, so that they had a much better visual acuity. The only other problem with it is that there were some people that actually suffered from retinal rejection. So literally the retina detached from the rest of the eye, so it caused permanent blindness. But it's one of those things that, whenever you think about like these super soldiers, you really put a lot of what they do on the equipment they use, like the scopes on sniper rifles, what's provided through their armor, like in the Milner helmet. But they actually can see much further and much clearer than the average human. And there's actually a couple instances in some of the books where they're talking about how they're seeing in low light or no light without their helmet on just fine, because they're picking up much more light, bouncing off of the objects around them. And I was like, man, that's actually kind of cool, because you think like, okay, maybe they can see off in the distance because of like some special software or hardware built into the helmet, and they really don't even need it. I mean, I'm sure the helmet and the equipment they use helps, but they really don't even need it to be, a step or two above the rest of humanity.
Yeah, because there was a scene in the book on Halo Reach. It talks about Halsey visiting the children. Well, they're not children no more. It's not too long after their surgery. They've been all taken to a cave facility where it's a decommissioned mine, and they were told to live there for about almost 3 months. Problem was there was no supplies. So what they did to test them out was they would, almost every day, they would bring in supplies. They would have 2 of these soldiers in exoskeletal forklifts. They were meant for taking, supplies and moving cargo. Well, they outfitted them with machine guns and everything else and retrofitted them. And the children, or the Spartans themselves, were supposed to fight their way and gain the supplies themselves. The place was extremely dark. So when they did these experiments, the only lights that were coming off were inside the rigs themselves, and they proceeded to disabling the cargo bots, or the two exosuit guys, quite effectively, and their speed and velocity was ridiculous. One of the Spartans, I forget her name, but I think it was Kim. She was considered one of the fastest of the Spartans.
Kelly,
And
yeah, Kelly.
was it Kelly? I know it
Yeah.
was Kim or Kelly. I know they have similar names. She was one of the fastest ones, and she darted in the room so fast that she was able to pull out the power cord off the back of the exosuit, because these suits, they don't have their own internal power. They have to actually have cables in the back. She pulled the power cord off the one, ran up to the other one, and took the cord, if I'm correct, and shoved it onto him, zapping the rig and decommissioning it. Afterwards, the others came in and took the supplies. The speed and her ferocity of it was so immense, and all that. It was a team building exercise as well, because even at the beginning, after the children were actually taken and they started doing their drills, like you said, they all became a family. Because on their very first day, when they first started, they literally had to do a obstacle course with 3 teammates. They all were signed with a teammate. The whole objective was for your whole team to get to the top and ring the bell, and you would win your prize. And their prize was food for the day. Well,
Yep.
John, or as known as Master Chief, won, but he never won with his team, so he never got the food. And that's where that whole team building exercise became. And that's how they all effectively became a family or a platoon.
The next augmentation would have been the best thing that they could have done. The way that they enhanced their muscles to move as fast as they did, I think that it would have been next to useless if they hadn't had this one. And it was a superconducting fabrication of neural dendrites. And basically what that did was it altered the bioelectrical nerve transduction. So basically what it did is it increased their reflexes by, I think, 300%. And
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, if you're moving super fast but you have slow reaction times, you're gonna stumble, you're gonna trip, you're gonna fall, you're gonna run into things, you're gonna not know how to compensate for your speed. So like even small gestures, like say a glass is falling off the edge of a table, you may have the speed to catch it, but if you don't have the reaction time to actually use your muscles correctly to snatch it, you're gonna miss it every time. Just as a dumbed down version of what this was actually used for. But the problem is that this actually caused diseases like Parkinson's in some of the washouts. So a lot of these augmentations, while they're really cool, they had a lot of bad side effects for a lot of them. And that's why they had, there was only like a graduating class after the augmentations of like 33 or 35 of the Spartan 2s that were originally launched. And I don't even think they had another class of the Spartan 2s. I think they were so expensive to make, and there was a lot of like moral ambiguity that Oni was jump roping with at the time, that they were like, well, let's not do this anymore.
That, and with the Human Covenant War starting not too long, a little bit after their training themselves, became a factor, and it was, it took too long to make them, and because of that, they had to scrap their more stricter kind of ways, I guess you could say. So it was more easily to produce them, but the quality of them would not be the same.
And that actually brings us to the next part of this class, the Milner armor. And the Milner armor is one of the most iconic things about Halo. I mean, John 117 may be the titular character, but nobody really knew what he looked like until, what was it, Halo 4? So for all intents and purposes, the Milner armor was the most iconic part of Halo because everybody knew that's a Spartan.
Mm-hmm. And they were the only ones that could wear these armors because of the augmentations that they took. They actually developed the armor prior and all that for regular human use, but the problem was the servos and the extra, the everything in the armor itself was so powerful. A guy put on the suit, just the arm, and he went to go move his arm just slightly, and it just took his arm and snapped it right in half. It was so powerful. The exosuit was so darn strong that it was just too powerful for a normal human being.
Yeah, that was just one of the test subjects. I remember in the part of the book where they're actually going to the planet, and it's like they're being like really top secret about it. They actually had another test subject, and I want to say that the first test subject was just like a regular run of the mill grunt, but then they put like a one of the hell jumpers into this suit of armor. I think it was a hell jumper. I could be wrong. But they put him in the full suit, and he tried to do the same thing. He tried to move his leg or his arm or something like that, and it ripped up on him. And through natural human, means, he flinched out of pain, and he ended up ripping his whole body apart and killing himself inside the suit because it was just too much for the regular human body to handle.
I believe also this is where they started that Spartans never die. They're just they're MIA. Because they wanted to have this whole mentality of the Spartans that they're such great warriors that they can never truly be killed.
But even beyond just the initial Covenant conflict, the Spartan 2s were actually put into play against outer colony insurrectionists, and a lot of that came into be, and that's where I'm going to set up our segue to the next class. Because during one of these missions where they were deployed against an insurrectionist movement is when we get introduced to a new member of Blue Team, and that was Kurt. Kurt was one of the graduating members of the Spartan 2 program, but he had a way of getting around certain obstacles. If Cortana picked the Master Chief for being her head and the person that she wanted to be the one to guard her because of his luck, Kurt was a close number 2 because Kurt was lucky, but he also had the same ability to tactically read situations as the chief. Now, they were on a mission to investigate, I can't remember, it's been so long since I read the book Ghosts of Onyx, but they were on a mission to investigate a insurrectionist or a Covenant presence in a system, and Kurt was actually abducted, and he was told that he was going to be given Chief Mendez to help him start the next Spartan class, the Spartan 3s. And Kurt's story in Ghost of Onyx was really intriguing. I felt like it had a little bit more human element to it, because as you're reading the initial books and playing the initial games, you see that the Chief is a super soldier, but very much like that voiceless protagonist that they have in the game, being Master Chief, you get a little bit more of Kurt's personality and who he is as a human being outside of just being a soldier, a super soldier meant to fight this insane war against an alien presence.
That's also why they started to add in AI to the armor. One, for tactical reasons. And two, almost like a counselor to the Spartans. Because you can imagine this battle-hardened soldier from birth, well, not really birth, from, well, I guess development from a young age. There's a lot of mental and conflicting issues and stuff like that, and it just like it builds on them. So they were made as, in a sense, a counselors that keep an eye on them, but also have them have a tactical use as well.
Kurt and Chief Mendez were put onto an isolated planet that had a very limited presence on it because they wanted to be a secret installation, and it ended up being a Forerunner shield world. Of course, they didn't know it at the time, but on this planet they start up the Spartan 3 project. And the Spartan 3s were, to me, drastically different than the Spartan 2s. Instead of having one graduating class, they had quite a few. So there was Alpha Company, had 300 graduating members. They were all killed in battle. They had Beta Company, another 300 members that graduated, all destroyed in battle. Gamma Company had 330. Yeah, 330. They had Delta Company, which was unknown how many graduated. And I'm not sure about how many were plucked out of these graduates that became headhunters. And headhunters was an interesting way to use the Spartans, at least the way that they were discussed at the time. The Spartan 2s were basically deployed in teams like 3 and 4 members, but headhunters were the Spartans which were given hyper-lethal vectors. They were to stand above the rest of their graduating class. They were far above the rest of them. And these headhunters were sent in solo or in teams of 2 to take on missions that were essentially suicide, and there was no other way to achieve the goals of the mission without using these hyper-lethal vectors. One of these characters was actually Noble Six, another silent protagonist that you played as in Halo Reach. He was also in a company, or put into the company of the Noble Team, and the rest of Noble Team were actually Spartan 3 members. Getting a little tongue-tied. They were Spartan 3 graduates that had made their way to Reach. So that kind of gives you an idea of, this timeline. So before the fall of Reach, the Spartan 3s were actually in service, and they were actually running missions. Now, their augmentation process was, I believe, called Project Chrysanthemum, and they had some widely different bio-augmentations than what the ones before them did.
And some were more specific for others for certain needs as well.
Yes, they had a very similar ossification process for their bones, but instead of it being like a surgical one, I believe it was drugs. So it wasn't like where they actually had to go in and do a surgery, which was, highly dangerous, but this was a drug. So it was a lot more invasive, a lot easier to pull off.
Yeah.
They had a fibroid muscular protein complex, but it was also a drug, as opposed to surgery and drugs like in the Spartan 2s. They had the retina inversion stabilizer drug, so they got the same effect on their eyes. They also had an improved colloidal neural disunification solution, and that basically greatly improved the individual's reaction time. So I want to say that it was not quite 300%. I want to say it was about that, though. They had damn near the same reaction time as a Spartan 2. But they also had other augmentations input into them. I believe it started in Gamma Company when they started doing this. They had a neural altering non-carcinogenic mutagen, and they also had bipolar integration drug and one other drug, but I can't remember what it was called. And basically, these drugs enhanced a more feral state. It allowed the Spartan to ignore the flight part of the fight or flight equation, and they had to put other drugs into these Spartans to keep them to where they were in an operational status. And if they went too long without these drugs, you would start to see those mood swings happen a lot more. You would see where they were relying more on their instincts as opposed to their training. They were a lot more feral. They were more like, if the Spartan 2s are Cyclops, the Spartan 3s were Wolverine, and not like regular Wolverine, like feral Wolverine. Wolverine without the nose after he'd had the adamantium ripped from his skeleton, and he had the bone claws instead of the metal claws.
Oh yeah, you could see that, and if you ever played Halo Reach, the Spartan or B283, the one with the curved machete, as you see in the process going through the whole campaign, you see him get more feral, more nasty, until the end where he gets impaled by an energy sword by an elite, and he's sitting there on the thing, and he's like, "Nah, fuck this." And he takes out his blade and just shoves it into his skull and just falls to the ground with it, dying in the process of it.
Yeah, he was definitely one of the most badass characters, and he was a fan favorite. I honestly think that more people liked him than they did Noble Six or any of the other members of Noble Team. Period. He was everybody's favorite, and it wasn't just because of his eye-catching armor. Because remember, he had, I believe it was an EVA armor helmet where it had the full display that covered that, like they had the gold face mask over the face, but it also went up above his forehead. But he had scratched a skull to the front of the mask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he had scratched it with his own blade. You could actually see him when you first see him. He's sitting there making nicks in his armor as he's sitting there waiting for the Noble Six and all that. He likes that savagery. He is, in a sense, that savage Spartan. He wants if he was the boogeyman of the Covenant, he would definitely be the boogeyman.
Oh yeah, it was one of he was one of those characters that made me reflect back on the series. And I'm like, why was he never given a hyper lethal vector? If he was such a badass, what was the difference between him and Noble Six? Because in the lore, Noble Six's file, most of it was redacted. Like anybody that actually took a look at his file couldn't ascertain anything that he had been doing for a long period of time because everything he did was solo. He was, if I'm not mistaken, he is one of the few headhunters who never went out on a two-man team. He was always by himself because he could do the job better solo.
Yeah, that also probably implies why of his armor. His armor was considered it was the EVA, but it was also considered a semi-powered infiltration armor. His armor was specifically made because he was part of the headhunters, and it had included the VISR, which was the virtual intelligence system. So he could, in a sense, as he's looking through his helmet, he can highlight and target and see what information he could find on the Covenant themselves. Like, what unit is this? And he looked at it, it highlights it, it tells him what this Covenant was, what weapon it was using, and he could tactically figure out what was going on and go from there.
Mm-hmm. And now, while I find Noble Team pretty cool in their own right, the some of the opening parts of Ghosts of Onyx, where they're talking about deploying the Spartan 3s en masse on these planets, was by far way cooler to me than what Noble Team was. And you got to think, they dropped a bunch of 12-year-olds that are in the Spartan 3 program on a Covenant-controlled world. It's a fuel depot, right? And they're supposed to go in there to shut down this fuel depot so as that they can hinder the Covenant's movement into human-controlled space. So they drop all 300 of these 12-year-old kids in semi-infiltration armor, like what you're talking about, and tell them to just go crazy. So these Spartans, these kids, are highly trained, they've been augmented, and they're invisible to the Covenant. And they're all rushing into this base, and they're just destroying everything along their way. I mean, you got to think, at this point in time, the Covenant has had the upper hand since the very beginning. But these 312-year-olds were so ferocious on this battlefield that there were whole platoons of the Covenant turning tail and running because they didn't know what was going on. They just saw everybody dying, and because they knew that it had to have been the humans, but they're invisible and they're fighting with such ferocity that they were just like, man, forget this. I'm out. I'm done. I'm tapping. And it ended up being just two of them that made it to the reactor and set the charges and blew it and jumped off into the water and got exfilled. And then they were brought back to Kurt on Onyx to help train the next class of the Spartan 3 program.
It even says, at a certain point, because they all went, yes, they all dropped, but they all stayed in teams of two mostly, together most of the whole time. Even it said, even as personally as they were so cocky and carefree during the whole thing, for God's sakes, that's how much they cared about these, their safety, because they thought they were so badass. And because of the whole situation, it talked about the Covenant had sent in their silent shadow group, as they call it, is their covert ops of the Covenant. They are pretty much Covenant elites that are decked out in super jet black armor, red energy swords, and all their whole purpose was to, secure and clear anything that was a hassle or a problem to them.
But I think that brings us to the Spartan 4 project. Now, the Spartan 4s, they had, I think at max they had 500, but they were active. So it wasn't like an extreme loss due to the augmentations like in the Spartan 2s, and they weren't used for suicide missions like the Spartan 3s. So they have the highest active members in the field. Their first class was 145. Their second class, I want to say, was like 160, 170 members. It may have been a little bit more, a little bit less. But one of the great things about that project was the physical augmentations that they did on them were less extensive. So they weren't as strong, as fast. They didn't have the same reaction time, but they were a cut above the rest of humanity. And they had the Gen 2 Milner armor, which wasn't as effective, but it was still pretty good, and it was less expensive because whenever they were talking about the original Milner armor set, they said that the amount of technology and materials put into those suits that you could have bought a cruiser and built it for that same price. So if you're talking about a suit of armor that's maybe the cost of like a Warthog or a Pelican as opposed to a full cruiser, that's a pretty drastic cost reduction there.
Yeah, if I remember when they first had the Mark Ones, when the Spartans themselves got to the planet, the scientists were actually talking about, man, this armor is so expensive. Like you said, a cruiser, or to them a Scorpion tank, which was one of the top of the line mechanical tanks of their time.
Their augmentations on the Spartan 4s where they had a Torpit data cluster installation. It basically gave a specialized neural implant taking from a Torpit data cluster capable of interfacing with an artificial intelligence. So that's actually built into the Spartan 4s as opposed to the armor. So like Chief had Cortana in the armor and he could like see a hologram of her interacting within his visor, or in certain cases like on his palm. But whenever she would jump to a system, you could see her displayed with the system. Well, this was actually built into the Spartan, so the AI could actually pop up in front of the subject's field of vision even when they're not inside their armor, if the AI is linked to that Spartan. They had a muscular and skeletal engineering series, which was drugs and surgery, but it was a lot less dangerous as opposed to the previous augmentations. They had a neurological series of tests and surgeries and drugs implemented as well. They had organ implantation as well, and that's where I kind of feel like maybe the Spartan 4s had a little bit more of a leg up. So as opposed to like maybe their lungs or their liver or their kidneys were damaged through the augmentation process in the previous classes, these actually, they got new organs, and some of them were they got a Stonewall pulmonary surfactant. I can't say that word. I'm sorry. Yeah. And basically, it increased their oxygen intake and allowed them to process airborne toxins and foreign gas mixtures within the pancreas at a lot safer rate. So, like, it would be like a person like me and you. If we walked into mustard gas, we're gonna drop. But these guys could withstand the mustard gas for, say 5-10 minutes. So, I mean, you got to think something that instantly kills and somebody being able to survive it for a period of time. That's a pretty significant jump and physical capabilities through this process.
They had the whole process of everything else in making these Spartan themselves. The Onyx and Oni and everything else, they dialed back on the more serious thing. This is when the point where Chief himself helped stop the Spartans or stop the Covenant and everything, and now it's kind of dialing back, and now they're not as serious, and now they're making soldiers that are still quite effective as, say, the original Spartans, but now it allowed them where if they ever wanted to, they could go home, quit, go back to their families. Some of the engineering and the bio effects, yeah, they could take out, but then they wouldn't have to worry about, say, I'm quitting. Okay, yeah, now we have to take all these fancy bioengineered things or cybernetics out of you. You're going to be here for like another 2 years, something like that. No, it's just they could actually go home and actually have families now.
Yeah, that was actually a really interesting point to me, because if you think about it, whenever they did the Orion project, they were concerned about where these augmentations can be passed on through these people's, family lines. And I think there was only one Spartan 2 that ever decided that she wanted to have kids, and they watched her very carefully. They put her under basically witness protection and watched her and her child. I think she had a daughter. And they were just watching to make sure she didn't grow up to be like a natural born Spartan. Like, yeah, her mother got the augmentations, but she got all or most of the benefits of these augmentations just from being a naturally born human being.
Yeah, they actually showed in what was supposed to be one of the Spartan 2s that kind of, in a sense, defected, in a sense. Mm-hmm. He stopped being a Spartan, but was still in the naval, the Navy itself. He became the security officer of this whole planet, this whole colony. And what it was, if I remember, Bravo team. I don't know if it was Alpha or Bravo. It was not. It didn't have John with them. I think it might have been Red team. They had to go and destroy part of the ring that had drifted from originally from John had destroyed with the first Spartans, or with it, on the Pillar of Autumn. Part of the ring had drifted, and they had to destroy it because it was coming towards the planet and was gonna probably do a cosmic annihilation for the colony. So they had to destroy that. Well, that said, Spartan that went with them on that mission had a child himself, and by the looks of her, it was actually a movie. She looked like a normal girl, but a normal girl, and the father is about 8 foot tall, and she's already 4 foot, like even half his height at age 10. So she's definitely gotten the benefit we could see of the increased size, but we don't know anything on her physical or anything else that we are aware of because it was not clear or shown after the movie.
Let's get into some personal feelings, because I think we've covered all of the classes pretty well. And of course, there's going to be some favoritism for the Spartan 2s, obviously, because of the Chief. But let's take a look here at these classes. So, our Project Orion was the beginning, and it had some pretty cool things. I mean, obviously, Avery Johnson did not look like he was in his 70s when he died. And he was keeping up with the Chief, and these guys that are like in their 20s and probably 30s couldn't keep up with him, and he's more than twice their age. So Project Orion actually had some benefits, but I wouldn't put it as the top project. The Spartan 2s and the Spartan 3s had a lot of moral ambiguity to them because of the way they were getting their recruits for these programs. But I honestly feel that the Spartan 2 project overall was the best. Now, if there was a way for you to get recruits and candidates for this program in a different way than, kidnapping children and letting their families bury their 7-year-old who died of cancer that they didn't know they had a year later, then I think that would be the best way to go about it, because even though their augmentation process was a lot more lethal, I think with the time and the technology growth over the series, they could have revisited the way they did the Spartan 2 program and made it a lot more efficient, a lot more cost effective, and where you wouldn't have as many washouts, as they call them. But there is that moral ambiguity, and there is that need to make the process a lot safer. But the Spartan 2s, by far, to me, are the best ones because, A, they're more efficient and more powerful, faster, stronger. They also had a different type of training, seeing as how they were raised from children into it, than what the Spartan 4s were. But at the same time, the closest ones to them were the Spartan 3s. But the Spartan 3s were basically sent on suicide missions, so you didn't really get a full grasp of their longevity and their potential over that longevity. And not to mention their craziness. Who wants a person that's gonna be in a battle with you, and the next thing you know, they haven't had their drugs, and next thing you know, they're turning on everybody, and there's nothing you could do to stop them because they're essentially a super soldier.
Right, and I think that's why they became like the headhunter squads as they were and everything else. But also the process of how they also got them, because during the Spartan 2 campaign, a lot of planets were destroyed, a lot of places were conquered by the Covenant, and a lot of people were had to be redirected, and orphans and everything else. That's where a lot of their main candidates did come from. They did stop the process of taking the Trotem, but they also had a greater use for them. A lot of the folks that happened during then did become part of the UNSC, any of the military, because of the Covenant themselves. It wasn't a oh, okay, they destroyed my planet, let me just go live somewhere else. No, it was, they're going to destroy our whole race. I need to help in any way I can.
I do like the one saving grace, and I hate saying it like that, but it's the best way I can think to describe it for the Spartan 4 project, is that they were actually talking to people who had lives already, and they were given a decision. Like, what do you want to do? You're a candidate for this. Do you want to go through with it? And most people actually said, yeah, let's do this. The only person that I can think of note that was on the fence about it was Buck, because Buck was originally an ODST, a hell jumper, and he was like, "No, I don't want to leave my team." But then he had actually a pretty good story about how one of his team actually betrayed him, and after this betrayal, the team kind of fell apart, and so he was like, "Okay, I'm ready to take the next step," and that's how he became a Spartan 4, which is how you see him in Halo 5. He was actually, present for Halo 3 ODST. You were actually a part of his team in that game. So Halo 4 wasn't his first appearance, but you saw him as an ODST as opposed to the super soldier that he was in Halo 5.
Mhm.
But I think that they were a necessary part. Humanity was going to have to evolve, and they were going to have to do it in a more morally okay and cost-effective manner. So the Spartan 4s are great in their own right, but I think that there's a far cry difference between the 4s and the 2s, but almost by night and day.
Right. And like you said, the Spartan 2s were made for a purpose. They were made for a major reason. They were supposed to help quell with the insurrections of most of the humanities, most of the terrorist group. But then, they said the Covenant War had begun, and now their main purpose, instead of the Covenant, or I mean the insurrectionists, it was the Covenant now. They were the tip of the spear that helped drive humanity to where they were now. And now the Spartans for the Gen 3, or Gen 4, excuse me, were made as the stepping stones for humanity itself to actually gradually become stronger and become more enhanced.
Yeah.
Not such a gigantic leap.
At the point that they saw their numbers being over like 300-400, and they actually had a mass amount of the Spartan 4s, that was during the you started seeing the Spartan 4s in Halo 4, and at that point they were dealing with insurrectionists. The Covenant War had come to an end, but there were still Covenant groups out there, people that still held to the religion of the Covenant, as well as separatist groups that came from the Covenant after the Covenant essentially disbanded and lost the war. So the Spartan 4s, that was their main job, is they had a less intense moment, so to say. They weren't fighting the Covenant War and fighting against human extinction, but they had a much wider variety of responsibilities to do, especially with the events of Halo 4. Whenever they start dealing with the Shield world and everything else, Requiem.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to start dealing with a lot more stuff and a lot of new vectors that they had to account for.
Oh yeah, it was also when you first started Spartan. What was it? Spartan. It was a Spartan 4, the Spartan Ops. You got to play as a Spartan yourself. You got to customize your own armor. You got to go to Requiem and play the missions there. But one of the very first cutscene is they're flying up from a Pelican, talking about the elite, this elite that apparently had a thermonuclear bomb and was threatening to destroy the city because of it,
Mm-hmm.
and all that. And it was just crazy. I mean, that means also that because the relationship that Chief and the elites had during near the end of the Covenant War has affected them. So does that mean now there are other, maybe another topic to touch on? Are there now Covenant, I guess, civilians that are living on Earth and other places together? Who knows?
There actually was a couple of those, but I think that is a topic for another day. I think we've done a pretty good introductory course to the Spartan classes. Me and Wolf, thank you for jumping into the video with us today. Stop by for our next video where we talk a little bit more in depth about individual Spartan teams. Hope you guys have a good one.